Penguin Random House Audio presents Revolutionary, George Washington at War, by Robert L. O'Connell. Read for you by Eric Martin. Introduction. The Generalissimo. He would have hated the concept generalissimo and all it implied. It was exactly the image he, and above all Congress, didn't want to project. He was simply the commander-in-chief of a legitimate governmental entity's fighting forces, vested with the anodyne moniker His Excellency, a generic term Washington regularly applied to state governors in his own correspondence. This was, of course, balderdash. Generalissimo would have fit the bill. He was, as everybody knew, the central protagonist in a profound national revolution, at once the ultimate director of all its violent activities and, through sheer force of will and decency, the chief brake on its potential for excess. At the time of his investment, only Elbridge Gerry was willing to admit Congress was making him generalissimo, yet no other word comes close to the reality of Washington's position and the magnitude of his task. This was no ordinary war, and he was no ordinary commander. This was a revolution, and the Washington here emerges as cunning and manipulative, a subtle puppeteer among intimates, and a master cajoler of those he did not command, but all in the cause of rectitude and moderation. He draped himself over the revolution, tamped down its fires, and became its embodiment, until he and it were nearly interchangeable. Perhaps because it all turned out so well, and he was carved into Mount Rushmore, the revolutionary context, with all its melodrama, paranoia, and treachery, has been de-emphasized. Still, the revolution was G.W.'s milieu. He was at heart a soldier, as much irregular warrior as regular one, and from this perspective he looks different. So does the American Revolution, particularly if you consider its timing. Superficially, the revolutionary process can be understood as steadily accelerating from the Stamp Act crisis in 1765 to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, propelled all the while by a series of maladroit British measures to squeeze more revenue out of the colonists, who inevitably rejected them on the grounds of their rights as Englishmen. All true, but different if you look in detail. While resentment was plainly building, the pattern was for things to settle down in the colonies once each incendiary event burned itself to embers. George Washington was hardly alone in early 1774, thinking the mob had gone too far in tossing the East India Company's tea into Boston Harbor. Then, in the summer of that same year, events exploded. In roughly the time it took to adjourn the First Continental Congress and assemble the Second, a period of less than a year, a network of revolutionary cadres known simply as the Association effectively eliminated royal authority from all 13 colonies. Everywhere the process appears to have been similar. First, Association members took over colonial militias and revolutionized them. This gave them the muscle to suppress loyalists with ominously named Committees of Observation and Inspection, and to grab the reins of government. In what amounted to a simultaneous burst of political alchemy, Patriots dominated locally and created independent state legislators out of colonial assemblies, and the transfer of authority was complete. By any measure, it was a stunning development. There is no ultimate model for revolution, but few have proceeded with such lightning suddenness, so little bloodshed, and then locked itself in place with such success. The revolution was effected before the war commenced, John Adams explained to journalist Hezekiah Niles more than 40 years later. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. It was an essential observation. The revolution never could have proceeded at such a pace unless vast numbers across all 13 colonies were not simply in favor of it, but fired up. What, then, was the source of the flame? This revolution was driven by ideas, and they raced across the colonies like a firestorm. Fortunately, we know a good deal more about the intellectual origins of the American Revolution than we used to, thanks to the pioneering efforts of historians Bernard Bailyn and Gordon S. Wood a generation ago. Previously, the conceptual framework of revolution was thought to have been built upon the writings of philosophers such as Montesquieu and Locke, along with suitable additions from the ancients, thoughtful and high-toned to the core. But when Bailyn and later Wood looked into the sources of what the colonists were actually reading, they found something entirely different and a great deal more ironic. The names that kept turning up were not philosophes, they were polemicists, radical Whig critics of the political system in England, most particularly of the fantastically successful regime of Robert Walpole. It was their cries against the perceived undermining of local say in determining tax rates, trial by jury, and, in general, the basic rights of Englishmen. Empire cost money, and it was their fingers that pointed to the huge and ever-expanding national debt, the price and dangers of a growing standing army, and the legion of politically appointed placeholders it took to run the whole thing, all of it suffused in a general aura of corruption. Critically, the radicals wove all these accusatory strands into a seamless fabric of conspiracy, one aimed at establishing a tyranny and basically removing all the rights of Englishmen. This was, of course, the worst case. From another perspective, it can all be seen as the unavoidable price of political stability and economic progress, both of which were undeniable. The radical critique was read and gained some influence, but never enough to make a real difference in the go-along-to-get-along atmosphere of Restoration England. But not in the fated 13 colonies. Here the effect combined elements of a time bomb and a poison pill. Separated from the source by 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean and often hundreds of miles of rough territory, here information carried a surcharge of rumor and exaggeration as it spread. Colonists, only half of them literate, heard what they wanted to hear. These were edgy and emotional people, living in an environment far less socially constrained than Great Britain's. 35 years prior, a wave of religious enthusiasms, the Great Awakening, had swept across the colonies. Now a new political tide was building to towering proportions. The message received, the bill of attainder against the parliamentary hegemon, came through stripped to its essentials and rendered explosive by its ineluctable bottom line. After they have flooded the place with brother-in-law officials and Anglican priests, taxed us at their discretion, cowed us with their redcoats, and stripped us of all our commerce, they mean to enslave us. That was the nub. In England, slavery was basically a concept and a commercial activity, not something you lived with. In the colonies, slaves were everywhere. The South was suffused with them. They would have been a frequent sight in the mid-Atlantic and all cities. In upper New England and along the frontier they were rare, but hardly unknown. Pretty much everybody had a visceral and existential sense of what it meant to be enslaved. For many it was even more personal, since they had arrived indentured and knew what it was like to have their freedom constrained. These were people primed to react to a certain kind of argument aimed at a certain kind of conclusion. It was, in essence, a conspiracy theory, and that, in large part, was its power to galvanize people into action. As G.W. succinctly put it, the British are endeavoring by every piece of art and despotism to fix the shackles of slavery upon us. It's everywhere in the sources. From the beginning, as far back as the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, protesters had accused Parliament of aiming to enslave them. The story never changed, and in the summer of 1774, when word reached the colonies of the parliamentary response to the Boston Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, the name said it all, triggered the American Revolution and the governmental clean sweep. Now, reducing a sophisticated political critique and the basis of our
Sample complete. Ready to continue?